It's the things that cause us the most grief that actually elevate us to places that we never imagined we'd be. We don't want to go through any grief-related event that we've dealt with. But the reality is, grief is tantamount to growth. Thank you for coming on another episode of the Grief Empowerment Theory. I'm Jay Lewis, and I truly appreciate the audience for giving me an opportunity to talk to them about a very important issue, which is letting them know that the grief, the challenges that they've gone through, no matter how interesting it is, you have a way to draw some strength from it. You can use it to your advantage. And today, I have an incredible privilege of having a young lady who has done exactly that. Her name is Portia Booker, aka the Grief Granter. And Portia's journey is interesting because she's done exactly what I like to talk about, letting people know that, you know what, things can knock you back, but it's how you decide to respond to them is the key. So, Portia, please let the world know what's going on.
Well, Jay, first of all, I extend my gratitude to you for opening your platform for me to come on. I thank you so much. And to your point about choice, I think a lot of people, when we experience, whether it's the loss of a spouse, in my case, both of my parents, friends, relationships, jobs, loss of self. I think a lot of us forget the choice that we have. We get to choose how we go about our grief journey, right? I think the world tends to mold us into thinking that your grief has to be full of anger, full of resentment, full of frustration, full of just a bunch of emptiness and enemies and greed, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? It's all about your perspective and your choice of saying, look, I know this is going to be heavy. I know this loss has inflicted me in some way, right? But you really need to ask yourself. And of course, in the initial part, you're going through the various stages of your grief, right? Whether it's feeling numbness, lost, not understanding, circling in a pool of murky water as though you're just trying to find your way back up to the top, yet alone the shore. So in the initial, you allow yourself to go with the flow. But once you start getting your footing back, this is where you really get to ask yourself, what do I want my grief experience to look like? And how do I want to take this experience and make it something impactful, paying it forward? And a lot of us may not know what that is in the very beginning. But I know for me, when both of my parents, especially my mom, when my mom transitioned on July, it's been 2 years, believe it or not. So crazy how fast time goes when you lose somebody. But
Absolutely.
my mom's transition 2 years ago on July 7th. One of the things that I remember, Jay, was when I picked up her ashes from the funeral home. The epiphany that came in the window as I was driving home literally said to me, Portia, what if your mom's transition is for your transformation? I didn't understand that. I'm like, wait a minute. In my eyes, couldn't I transform a little better as she was here? Right? That's the initial thought. But at the same time, I recognize when I look back at it now, I think a lot of times when we are caregivers, we sometimes, in a sense, start to die ourselves because we put so much emphasis and focus on caring for our loved one, which don't get me wrong, Jay, I wouldn't trade that experience for the world of being a caregiver for my mom, having the flexibility to quit my corporate job to do so. At the same time, I made that my sole focus to the point that I stopped going out with my friends. I stopped going to concerts. I stopped doing my writing, my art, playing my guitar, doing photography. I stopped doing all that stuff because my sole focus was on my mom and trying to see how I could get her better. And when I think about now that she's transitioned, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the time that we spent together the last couple years before she transitioned. And at the same time, my heart is still saddened that she's not here. However, I've been given the gift of time back, and I get to choose now how I shape my day, how I pay it forward, and how I go about my grief without the restrictive noose that's often placed upon us in society.
That you just said a mouthful, Portia, and I'm serious about that because it's interesting. Going back to your original point, the world wants us to see the grief and the doom and gloom element of what it is. And don't get me wrong, it's it's difficult when you have some type of circumstance that causes you any type of grief, whether it's a loss of a person or, like you said, a job, whatever it is. But over time, you have to get what I call tired of being sick and tired of having the grief control you. And at some point, you have to ask, what do I do about this energy, this negative energy? And like I said, uh, with the grief empowerment theory concept, the philosophy is simple. Negative, all energy can be transferred or transformed. So, negative energy can be flipped. You just have to learn what your catalyst is. And belief is my whole thing about understanding that once you believe that you can do it, then you can do it. So I wanted to touch on that point because, again, you and I are like mirrors in that respect. I truly I appreciate that fact that you understand that it's not always the morbid seeking sympathy approach to grief. It can open up a new door. Talk to me about the fact that, again, you said that when you were picking up your mother's ashes, you were asking yourself, you know, where do I need to go? At what point did you finally say to yourself, you know what? I'm going to listen to that voice and I'm going to do what I need to do?
Jay, I want to backtrack a little bit. So before I picked up my mom's ashes, I remember, and I might get emotional saying this, but I'm going to go through it anyway. I remember the day that I got the call of my mom's oxygen levels not going above 70. And I remember after I hung up the phone with the hospital staff, I made my way up to the hospital, which is not far from my house. And as I was driving there, I said a prayer to God. I said, God, if it's my mom's time to go, I surrender her back to you. But I need you to keep me one promise to let her go peacefully. And the reason why I asked for that, Jay, is because my mom, as a result of her interstitial lung condition that was progressive, she developed a unique anxious energy where she was afraid to sleep at night because she was afraid that she would stop breathing in her sleep. And so when I asked for that, God granted it for me. And when I think about back to your question, as far as me taking the opportunity to listen to that voice, I remember after my mom actually transitioned, when I came home and went to sleep, the very next day when I went out on the front porch, the sky was the same color pink as my mom's robe that she wore in the hospital. And I remember saying a prayer to God. I said, God, I know this grief is going to be heavy, but I want to do it different this time than the other times that I've gone through loss. Send me help. Send me help. And Jay, I didn't know what that help was going to look like, but I had made a choice. Even though I knew it was going to be hard, I made a choice right then and there to experience a new way of grieving, actually doing it from a healthy standpoint instead of what I see a lot of people result to, and even in my own journey of the first loss, the first biggest loss that I ever had, and we don't talk about this in life, is my dream job. A lot of people know that I was a TV producer for a very well-known network. And as my dream career was crumpling, we don't talk about the grief that goes along with the identity that you are married
Yes.
to because you work so hard to get there. That defined you, right? And when that identity is stripped away from you, suddenly you don't know what to do. You don't know who to talk to. And then people who you do talk to, this goes back to my point about the societal narratives. People often respond to you with regurgitated scotch tape phrases or platitudes that really are not comforting. I remember hearing from somebody who I confided in, oh, it's just a job, get another one. Really? Okay, so let's go back to both of my parents transitioning, or my mom. We're talking about my mom right now. You wouldn't tell somebody who just lost their mom, just go find another
No.
one, right? So when I think about that time period and making that conscious choice, I didn't know what the outcome was going to be. I just knew in my heart, and to your point about believing, I just believed there was another way. Because I didn't want to be 6 feet under like my mom. I didn't wanna be 6 feet under like a lot of people, unfortunately, when they go through loss or grief. I didn't want to result to negative behaviors such as addiction or anything like that like before. I didn't want to do that. I wanted it to be different. At the same time, I didn't know what the different was gonna be, but I made the choice to stick the course either way.
You know what? It's interesting because, like you said, everybody's journey is interesting. And like my journey is similar to yours in certain respects. Like when you talked about your mother's oxygen level, I remember my wife's oxygen levels. I got the call from the hospital and that her oxygen levels were going down and her blood pressure was crashing. She had two issues going on at once. And, you know, that's interesting. But what was crazy, I decided when she passed, I did take the speedball to hell approach. Man, I was drinking, I was smoking as much weed as I possibly could, and everything because what I wanted to do was get as far away from the pain as I could. But what I didn't understand was that the minute I sobered up, the monster of grief was so much bigger. And that's something that, I know I talk to a lot of people about. Now, I understand that, you do a lot of speaking. And, you know, again, between your television show and you've written a book, what is your core message to people about understanding that grief is not the doom and gloom all the time?
I think, Jay, my core message for everybody is giving yourself the permission to choose your grief journey. And I'm not saying that grief isn't sad. It's sad to lose anybody, anybody. It's sad to let people who have made such a mark an impression on us to see them leave. At the same time, there's a blessing within that death. There's a rebirth because their transition truly does birth a transformation within us, whether we see it from the get go or we don't. Each person who has come into our life left something with us, whether it was a phrase, a smile, a characteristic that we have adopted as one of our values. We are left with something from each person who crosses our paths, everybody. And we carry those with us. And it's up to us to keep their legacy alive and find a way to continue to speak about them and not bury them the way that society does. So I think my biggest core message, if you want to call it, Jay, is finding gratitude within your grief journey because your grief is the love that you have for that person, that job, that relationship, yourself, versions of yourself that you're shedding layers in order to elevate to the next level or endeavor. That's part of your story. At the same time, remember that the grief is the memories. Hold on to those. But you really get to choose at the end of the day how you want those memories to either hinder you or elevate you. At the end of the day, in my eyes, Jay, when there is gratitude in any room, there is never a loss at all.
You know what? That is absolutely true because the gratitude allows you to think about the time that you've had with that person. And instead of instead of spending your waking thoughts concentrating on the end date of their tombstone, you concentrate on the dash in the middle because that dash in the middle, a part of it represents the time you spent with them, what you learned from them, what cherished relationship you created within that time frame. When you see it that way, it definitely brings a totally different thought process to you. It's interesting because a lot of people want to celebrate the the time they have with the person, but they end up celebrating the end date because, again, like you said, society directs them to the end date. It directs them to the fact that, hey, you're not going to see this person again. You know, and that becomes mentally and emotionally taxing. So that's wild. Let
I
me
want to
ask.
add to that really quick, Jay, about society's messaging, right? And I'm going to speak from the space of being open to continued communication with both of my parents who have transitioned. I think a lot of times we find conversations like this to be quote unquote taboo, woo woo. At the end of the day, you said it at the beginning, having the belief that there is still a connected love line between you and the person who transitioned. For me, I got that confirmation, Jay, 3 days after my mom transitioned. Just like I'm going to go a little biblical, but I'm speaking from a spiritual standpoint. Just like how every year in March or April, depending on the calendar year, we celebrate Easter, Jesus's resurrection, right? We can apply that same, if you want to call it rhetoric, to our loved ones' transition anniversaries, right? Because in some way, shape, or form, we've risen to an extent from the hurt, whether we acknowledge it or not. And for me, 3 days after my mom's transition day, there was a monarch butterfly flying in my front yard. And I don't believe that there is anything such as coincidences. I believe everything happens for a reason, whether we accept it or not. And just like today, I still celebrate both of my parents, their birthdays and their transition day. I don't call it their death day because to me, death doesn't make sense. It's a transition. I celebrate their birthdays and their transition days. I use them as days to reevaluate my goals for the year, my business. I also make it a point to, excuse me, do something that they loved or eat a meal that they loved. So, my mom's birthday this year, January 16th, one of the things that I did was me and my brother went to dinner. Well, earlier in that day, my mom hated cats. My mom was not a fan of cats. She didn't like them. Well, of course, being here in Ohio, it gets cold in January all the way to May sometimes. You never know whether you're going to be bundled up like an Eskimo in Alaska or Antarctica, or are you going to have on maybe, just a hoodie and some jeans? You never know, right? The weather is a hodgepodge of things. And as I was about to take Mr. Fletcher out, those you know Mr. Fletcher, my doggy, he goes for multiple walks of pee o'clock a day. And as we were gonna go outside for pee o'clock number one, this cat comes on the porch and puts his paw up to the glass. Now, Mr. Fletcher is not a fan of cats either, but the fact that Mr. Fletcher did not bark at that cat on our porch told me something. So again, coincidental, depending on your beliefs, to me,
So,
that was confirmation. The fact that it was on my mom's birthday and she didn't like cats.
but, okay. Now, first off, let me explain something. Your mother was really cool. Why? She was a January baby. I born on the 8th. So I understand. Now, the other thing is, I'm sorry she didn't like cats. I love cats. I got a cat. That's a whole different thing. But I understand. Listen, seriously, um, I interviewed a gentleman who is a psychologist, and you know, his name is Dave. But what was interesting about Dave was he unfortunately, okay, Dave Roberts, you know him. He lost his daughter, and you talked about the butterflies. Now, he told me a story about the fact that he was walking his grandchild and a butterfly came on to him. And then he also talked to me about a book called Many Lives, Many Masters, written by Dr. Weiss. And this particular book, it actually talked about um, kind of more of an afterlife type of thing. Because Dr. Weiss, he he's a psychotherapist and he had this patient type of thing. And it ended up changing his mind from a strictly scientific mind to a mind open to possibility. And the reason why I bring this story up is just for the fact that, you just said, look, a lot of people want to call it woo woo, whatever, what have you. But the truth of the matter is, before we had some defined logical science of all this, for millennia, people had all these different explanations in relations to transition periods and things of that nature. And there were many things that we want to call coincidence now that were clearly signs then. You know, I mean, like I said, it I have similar things. I mean, like certain days of my wife's transition or birthday or whatever, what have you. I see certain signs. I see certain things. Of course, I'm not going to tell anybody that because I don't want them thinking I'm crazy. But in the same turn to screw, I think people, when you find people within your tribe who understand, that's a different circumstance. Now, allow me to ask you this. When you finally made the decision to accept that there my my mother's world, of course it's no longer here in this plane. It's more of an ethereal circumstance, but I'm still going to celebrate the time that I have with her, because I know that, like you said, family members, friends, they were all like the chapter of that book is closed, and they don't want to revisit it, so they have a difficult time when you revisit it. When you decided to just override all that and just say, I'm going to do what I need to do, you know, where was your head in that respect? Were you ready to lose people? Were you ready, ready to tell people, hey, listen, this is just the way I think? What was on your mind?
Jess, that's a very good question, and I think the biggest part of keeping my mom's legacy alive, my mom's name is Shay, by the way, the biggest part of that came from a space of anger, believe it or not. We talk about anger from such a negative space, but if anger is channeled right, it can really be beneficial. And that anger actually came out as my audiobook, Finding Grace Within Grief, Her Transition, My Transformation. And that book, believe it or not, Jay, started from writing 2 angry letters to God because I wasn't happy. And I was raised in a household where you weren't allowed to question the decisions that God made. You weren't allowed to hold God accountable. And I was holding all that anger in, and it was manifesting or projecting as no sleep, shortness of breath, holding my breath, forgetting to breathe, forgetting to eat, isolating myself from people. And when I wrote those 2 letters to God, I mean, Jay, I'm surprised, not to offend anybody, I'm surprised that the Bibles in my house didn't catch on fire with some of the stuff that I said. But God's shoulders are big enough to handle it, right? And when I wrote those letters to God, I literally asked God the question, "Do you find pleasure in watching your children suffer?" And believe it or not, Jay, because of course, knowing me, because I was ready to take my boxing gloves in my front yard and me and God was gonna have it out
Right.
like UFC, WWE, SmackDown versus Raw, play all of my heavy metal playlists, and we going at it, and it still won't be enough. That's how I was feeling. But believe it or not, doing that helped me to really accept that this is my new normal and open up the discussion and my creative wheel box. Because mind you, I hadn't been writing anything for years. I'd always wanted to become a published author. But of course, again, to my point in the beginning, when you're a caregiver, you put
Right.
your primary focus on the person you're caregiving for. And when I wrote those letters, I found that sense of relief. I found, and of course, God responded too. God did. God's response to me was, "Sit down, my child. Come sit. Come sit." And of course, you know how everybody tells you to calm down when you're not
Loud.
in the mood to it's the
Yes.
wrong response. That's how I felt. But God's approach was a little different. God was like, "Come sit down, my child. Let's have a talk." And pretty much God told me, "Portia, I love you. However, I knew that this grief was going to be heavy when I took mommy away. at the same time, I needed you back. You were putting too much focus on being her caregiver instead of what I put you here to do. So that was the, if you want to call it, confirmation for me, Jay, that there was something bigger through
Yeah.
my mom's transition. And so my audiobook, Finding Grace Within Grief, was that response and answer that I needed in the initial parts of my grief. So I would say, back to your question, my headspace was in, if you want to call it, the driver's seat to make a statement. Even though it was anger rooted, the outcome for me was change. That's what I was aiming for.
You know what? That that's absolutely understandable because grief, grief, it's going to change you no matter what. Whether you decide to stay stagnant or have inaction, grief doesn't care. It's going to happen, you know. But taking the proactive approach and figuring out how to work with the transition is a benefit because you know, kind of adding on to my question to you with more of a statement than a question. It's interesting because see, nobody understands the level you feel because of your relationship. This was your mother. And again, even, you know, you may have siblings and what you do, and your siblings, their response is, you know, it's not the same as yours. Although, you know, you come from the same womb, you had similar experiences, but everybody sees things differently. I mean, I had to have that understanding. I call it a come to Jesus moment because, you know, hey, I remember for me, it was one time I'm sitting there, it's me, my mother-in-law, and my daughter. And we're all having this friendly conversation about my wife. Within 10 minutes, it became a battle royale because it was like, you know, well, my mom was this, and then it was my daughter was this, and then it was, well, my wife was this. And I'm realizing we're all under the same umbrella. We're just getting wet on different sides. And, you know, again, so back to what I enough of me, but the
I
back
wanna
to what
add to that what you just said, Jay, because I think a lot of people, when we're in the crux of our grief, it's very personal. It is very
yes,
personal, and so it's easy for us to wanna fight over the spotlight of whose relationship trumps each other's. But at the end of the day, the common denominator is the loved one who transitioned.
yes,
They are the common thread that connects each of you. And to your point, I had to get to that playing field as well about my siblings and their relationship with my mom, along with my mom's siblings and the rest of our family. Because I know all of them have a different relationship with her. And also, they have a different relationship with me. So I had to take into account that other connecting piece because, right, the central seed of connectivity has gone. So now inside of this soil is just roots that
yep,
are related, but they no longer have the central nucleus of keeping them all together, right? And because of that, the kind of the relationship bond can either be
yes,
weaker or stronger, depending on the amount of time that has gone by since the person transitioned. Also, it's an individual journey. Grief is very individual and independent. At the same time, we have to be aware of other people's grief and the fact that not all the time everybody's going to be as proactive about their grief the way that we are, depending on our outlet of, venting or getting the heaviness off. So I think that's another key component that people have to remember is don't compare. It's very easy to say, but it's
Yes.
very easy to do. Cause I remember I had a situation with a family member a couple of months ago where they were talking to me about my mom. And I think they were just having a bad day, is how I look at it. I didn't want to take it personally, but I found myself wanting to take it personal when their response to me was, well, I knew them first before you.
Yeah.
Right. So it's very easy for me to project that hurt back. Instead, for me, I was aware of what they were saying and aware of how it was making me feel internally. So I did not respond to their
Right.
projection. Instead, I just gave them still my love. I'm here if you need me. But I knew internally that was pulling on me because, in my eyes, how dare you say that when we are both connected through this
Right.
person?
Right. What's interesting is that it almost seems like no one wants to recognize your hurt. Not that they don't, but they want, like you said before, they want to trump theirs over
Yep.
yours. And you're sitting there, and now you feel like you have to be the person that has to bag back a little bit,
Mhm.
because if you end up launching like a rocket, now this
Mhm.
is just this is just fire fighting fire.
Yep.
And because they're not going to back down. Every people want they want to feel right, so they're going to do everything they can to prove themselves right, and that obviously means not not letting go of certain things. And
Yep.
sometimes you have to be that bigger person to do it. it it's horrible because you know it looks like and it feels like a sign of weakness, but what's interesting about that, it's probably one of the most incredible situations of strength that there can be,
Mhm.
because when you can make that kind of look, Portia, you know what, I need to stop, because you and me, this I am put it this way, yo girl, I'm feeling you. Well, I'll put it like that, because no, seriously, because so much of of what you were discussing obviously was what I was. This goes on in every family situation. What do you say to people that are experiencing these type of things now? How do you go about letting them know that what they may be seeing from others, what they may be feeling, it's not personal to you, it's just the way that they're trying to vent? How do you go about that?
Jay, that's a very good question because, first of all, I want everybody who's tuning in to remember that how you're feeling is valid. I'm going to say that again. Your feelings are valid. I think a lot of times with grief or with any emotions, we say feelings are not facts. But I disagree. Your feelings are your facts because nobody else can speak for you. So, how you're feeling is valid for you. The second part to that is I want to remind everybody that as you are on your grief journey, it's gonna be a hilly ride. It is. And it takes, number one, a community of support of people to really help you to stay grounded. Number two, the other thing I want to remind everybody is the importance of doing the deep work too. Because a lot of times, and I'm going to speak on this from personal experience, when you don't work on your grief, sometimes you become the toxic one.
Yes.
I'm going to be, and I'm going to speak from personal experience. I recognize that within the last year, that in some situations, I had become the toxic one because my grief of losing both of my parents had become kind of a badge of honor that I was using.
Mhm.
And so I had taken on this new toxic identity that really I didn't want to take on, but it
Right.
just happened to infiltrate at the right time. And once I started to recognize that, I said, "Ooh, I don't want to have this association anymore. I need to change this." So as people are going through their grief journey, I want everybody to just remember your feelings are valid, how you feel, where you're at this present time, whether it's been a year, 2 years, 20 years, however many years, your feelings are valid. Number two, you get to choose. You get to choose how you go about your grief journey. Do you want to stay in doom and gloom, or do you want to find a way to be grateful for the lessons that you learned from this person, right? Reinvent how you see, how you feel, and your experience because you get to remember the lessons, and as I mentioned before, each person who we encounter, they leave something with us. They leave a piece of themselves with us. So how can we keep their memory alive and use that as a way to be the best version of ourselves, right? Number three, being intentional. Intentional with your time with people, intentional with how you spend your day, intentional about how you go about each encounter where you might be triggered from your grief. The other thing is showing others empathy because a lot of times people become very bitter when they lose somebody, right? And you have to really, this goes back to awareness, being aware of how would you want somebody to respond to you when you had lost somebody? What was the response you were seeking? Learn to pay that forward. And then also,
Yes.
my biggest one, forgiveness. You've got forgiveness has been, in a sense, the butter that
Mhm.
crops everything when it comes to our grief journey because it's very easy for us to hold on to those feelings of
Yes.
resentment, guilt, isolation, making enemies and, frustration, fear. It's very easy for us to hold on to those things. But we need to, number one, remember to forgive not only the other people around us and truly do it. You don't have to be in the same
Mhm.
space as them, but also remember to forgive yourself because you don't know what you don't know. At the
Yes.
same time, now that you do, what are you choosing to utilize that knowledge with now? Are you going to continue to sit on it, or are you going to actually take that toolbox of information and deep work and actually apply it?
And it. Huh, okay, you brought up five really good points. And the fifth one, that's the one that seriously, I think that's one that a lot of people going through some type of grief circumstance have a very hard time with because the forgiveness circumstance. It's first off, like the first thing is they don't want to forgive outsiders if somebody has wronged them in a certain way, shape, or form.
Mhm.
What they're not realizing also is, like you said, they're not willing to forgive themselves. And it's interesting because I know again I'm talking about myself. Portia, it's my bad. But seriously, like I remember when I when my wife passed away, you know, I spent a long time thinking about every argument we had, thinking about, you know, all the times where I should have just been like, I, versus, all those times. And you beat yourself up, is kind of the point that I make. You beat yourself up. And I know a lot of people do it. And, but the reality is finding a way to reposition that that anger, because you said it in the beginning, that anger can actually be a catalyst to bring you to another level. But again, it has to be transitioned properly, it has to be understood. And a big part of that forgiveness training, I'm going to say this, is that you have to start taking responsibility. You have to take responsibility because, and that's not blame. That's a whole different thing, you know. But responsibility is, hey, where were you? What did you do? What was your situation? And then forgive yourself of that, and then don't do it again. That's the whole thing. But um, first off, this has been an amazing conversation, seriously, because, like I said, I am literally sitting there feeling like I am talking to the female version of myself, and 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 it's interesting, but I think that anyone who is willing to have that conversation of truth with themselves can relate, because when you find a, like I said earlier, you find a tribe of like-minded individuals, you know and of course the way we think about the grief journey that we're on, 98% of the population will look at us cross-eyed. But then there's that 2% that understand where you're going. And it's like gravitating to that 2% when, society wants you to be in 98. But it's like that 2% represents not being in the herd, you know, and it's so weird. But anyway, I just wanted to say, Portia, seriously, thank you. Before I go, talk about talk about the grief grantor really quickly. I mean, I've seen a few episodes, but talk about it because it's clearly from the heart. It's clearly from the heart. Talk more about that and about how the whole concept came about really quickly.
Yeah. So again, Jay, thank you so much for having me on the show. So the Grief Grand Tour TV show on E360 TV, it's funny how the whole concept came about because let me go back a little bit. When my mom transitioned in July of 2022, I was still hosting my radio show, Grew with Portia on WOVU here in Cleveland, Ohio. And one of the things that I did to really also help me with my grief journey was creating a 3-part series on grief and end of life procedures on my radio show, Grew with Portia. And that was kind of the door opening to holding more conversations about grief, because that's when I recognized that grief wasn't just limited to physical transitions,
Yes.
right? There's the grief of us losing ourselves. There's the grief of the childhood we didn't have. There's the grief of the relationship with our person, our spouse, or whatever that didn't manifest into something that we truly wanted. So there's other avenues of grief that we don't talk about. And so when I took my show off of WLVU to kind of go on a hiatus to really give myself that time to ask myself, okay, Portia, Now that mom is gone, this is even before my dad transitioned, what direction do we want to go? What do we want to do? And the opportunity came about in a dream, realistically. And I did this online challenge. And when I did this online challenge, the week after I had this dream, the TV show kept popping up. And I said, okay, well, what is this about? And so, of course, a lot of times when you want to manifest something, you start seeing it in visions and
Yes.
then you take action and then the doors start opening for you. So one thing kind of led to another. I'm giving the short version.
Mm,
And the show launched in October of 2023, which is parallel to when I started my TV career at the big TV network 7 years prior. So it's
okay.
funny how I signed the paperwork the same day as the same day that I started in TV.
And
So it was kind of like, talk about karmatic in a way.
yes. Uh,
And so I started the show. The show's premise is utilizing gratitude as a way to evolve our grief. And as I mentioned in the beginning, Jay, I'm a firm believer that where gratitude is present, nothing is truly lost.
I, you know, I truly love your premise. I watched a couple of shows. I mean, I was watching the one where you were talking about your Halloween costume, where you were with the minion thing, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, it. But what was interesting, seriously, the core of every conversation was the fact that you know you were letting people know about, like you said, the gratitude aspect of grieving, which is something that, of course, again, what we talked about in the beginning, a lot of people don't want to gravitate to. It's it's interesting because everybody knows that they're going to pass. The biggest mystery is when it's going to happen. And then what ends up happening after that, we still get really frustrated, really upset about it. And not that we shouldn't, because obviously the person that we loved or cared about, or the circumstance, it, hey, there is a there has to be a mourning period with anything. But to prevent mourning from becoming some type of long-term grief situation, at a point you have to have gratitude, because gratitude will break that barrier. Like I said before, you're no longer celebrating the end date. You're now celebrating the dash in the middle, because you are a representative of that dash in the middle. Your time that you have with them is special to you and special to them. It's, I mean, it's interesting because you your show using gratitude to help people understand their grief journey. That's amazing. I mean, I'm saying just like that, Portia, because you know it takes a minute for a person to honestly recognize that there's a gratitude aspect to it. So for you to be able to kind of pinpoint that, and then to be able to explain it to an audience, to have them understand that it's important because it's part of your healing. You know, in order to help your healing journey, you want to be able to understand the time that you spent with that person, and that acquaints to the gratitude that you have within the relationship that you built with that person. Again, Portia, I talk to the death, and I'll talk all day on this thing. Portia Booker, ladies and gentlemen, the grief granter. I mean, definitely watch a show. Definitely pick up a book. I mean, her show. You can actually. I just streamed it on the on the screen. You can go right there. And let me ask you this, Portia, before I
Mhm.
let you go. What are some of the? How can we get in touch with you? How can people touch base with you if they want to be able to talk to you, come on your show, you know, want to share their experience? How would they be able to reach out to you?
So again, Jay, thank you so much for having me on your show. I appreciate it. So those of you who want to connect with me, I am on Instagram at Portia the Grief Grand Tour, LinkedIn and Facebook, Portia Booker, or you can do a Google search of Portia Booker. 9 times out of 10, you will find me. And the other thing too, as of right now, I am on sabbatical from hosting my show right now. But once I do start back up, you can, send me a message, because I'm always looking for, unique stories about grief and how people have in a sense alchemized their grief and turned it into a movement and have paid it forward. The other thing, Jay, really quick, that I want to share with your audience today, when you talked about just now, you know really being intentional about your grief journey and that whole thing, I want to remind everybody that grief is duality, right? Grief really teaches us about duality, that even though, yes, there is sadness, there is also sunshine. Even though there is hurt, there is also healing. And just remember that you get to choose how you go about your grief journey. And again, when gratitude is in the room, there is no such thing as loss. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Portia Booker, ladies and gentlemen, definitely, definitely check out the Grief Granter. I want to say again, thank you so much for your time, Portia. I really appreciate this.
Anytime, Jay. No
La-
problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, have a good one. I will see you next Wednesday. Again, in the meantime, understand that find a way to transform your grief into your gift. Thank you. Have a good one.